I've always enjoyed this film, the Wes Craven Classic Scream. I'm Kevin Porter, and you're watching Video Rental Chaos.
By the 1990s, a lot of people were feeling like there wasn't a film that had come along just yet to define that generation. Enter Wes Craven. Horror fans will always recognize him for his classic horror films, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Scream was just one of those movies that came along at the right time and scared a lot of people around the world, as it became one of the highest grossing films for the year 1996. I hope you're not alone watching scary movies tonight, because you might just want to ignore that unknown phone call. Let's jump right into the horror smash hit, Scream. We open with Casey Becker all alone getting ready to watch a scary movie with her boyfriend Steve. She gets a weird phone call from someone as they casually start talking about horror films. The caller asks her, what one is your favorite? Things take a quick turn when the mystery caller threatens her life and her boyfriend's as well. It's shown that Steve has already been tied up on the patio. Casey is now forced to play a game in order to save her and her boyfriend's life. Unfortunately for Steve, Casey has no clue about Pamela Voorhees being the original killer in the Friday the 13th film. Steve is then gutted in a pretty gruesome scene. This turns out to be a pretty epic opening to the film, as Casey is then chased around her house all while her parents are just getting home. They then find Casey strung up dead from the tree in the front yard. Sidney Prescott is shown in her room when all of a sudden her boyfriend Billy Loomis shows up. Her dad hears the scream and tries to enter the bedroom, but Sidney is able to convince her dad that everything is fine. We find out that he's leaving early the next morning out of town for work. Billy and Sidney then have a weird conversation about the lack of sex in their young lives. Billy compares their relationship to The Exorcist, but then reveals that he was watching it on TV and all the good stuff was cut out. The next day at Woodsboro High School, the press has descended onto the small town as word of the gruesome murders the night before has spread fast. We are introduced to the cast of characters: Stu, Tatum, Randy, and lastly Tatum's brother Dewey, who is a deputy sheriff in the small town. Plus, we get to see Gail Weathers for the first time, as she was a key reporter the year prior, covering the murder of Sidney's mother. Since Sidney's father is out of town, the decision is made to stay at Tatum's house for the weekend. After catching a nap, Sidney also gets a phone call from the unknown killer. We learn that the Ghostface killer is in the home and chases Sidney. Right in the nick of time though, Billy shows up again through the window and a cell phone pops out of his pocket. This causes Billy to become the lead suspect as he's taken into custody. In one of the more famous scenes in the movie, while Sidney is leaving the police station, Sidney cold cocks Gail Weathers right in the face. While at Tatum's house though, Sidney is called again by the mysterious Ghostface, thus leading the viewers to believe it wasn't Billy after all. The phone calls are eventually traced back to Sidney's father's cell phone, but they're unable to track him down. Billy is released the next day and he and Sidney see each other at school. The two are still at odds. After the continued mystery of the killings and now the attack on Sidney the night before, Principal Hembry suspends school and a curfew is now in effect. After this is announced, we see a sweet cameo from Wes Craven himself playing Freddy the janitor. Moments later though, Principal Hembry is murdered by Ghostface. With the news of school being out for the foreseeable future, Stu decides that the time is right to throw an epic party at his home celebrating no more school. We continue to wonder who the real killer is as we get a scene at the video store with Randy, Stu, and Billy talking about who is the prime suspect. Later that night though, Gail Weathers shows up and continues to charm Deputy Dewey as she's able to sneak in a hidden camera into the party. We see Tatum ultimately being taken out by the Ghostface killer when she is stabbed and then crushed by a garage door. We soon learn the rules of surviving a horror film as Randy provides the details. Once word is out that Principal Hembry was killed and hung up at the goalpost at the local high school, a majority of the party leaves to go see if they can catch a glimpse of the principal's dead body. While this is occurring though, Dewey and Gail are walking the street as a report has come in as Neil's car has been possibly found. Well, they find the car as they're almost run over by the leaving teens. Billy shows up at the home and he and Sidney make up, and Sidney ends up breaking one of the main rules of survival in a horror film and makes a legit porno with Billy Loomis. Soon after, we see Ghostface appear out of the shadows and stabs Billy in the chest. While Sidney is on the run, Ghostface takes out the cameraman and manages to stab Dewey in the process. Gail attempts to flee the scene but proves her hand at being a very bad driver and crashes the van as we believe she is dead as well. Sidney is now faced with the decision of who's the killer. Is it Randy or is it Stu? Soon we see that Billy is not dead and takes the gun from Sidney. He then uses a line from Psycho as he shoots Randy in the shoulder, and it's revealed that Billy and Stu are the Ghostface killers. Also, they had killed Sidney's mom the year earlier. The plan was to pin the current murders on Sidney's dad and then begin to plan the sequel as the only survivors. Well, that plan did not go over so well as Sidney escapes and is able to call 911. We see Sidney kill Stu as she drops a huge TV right on his head. Billy is about to take Sidney's life for good, but Gail shows up out of nowhere and shoots Billy. Randy is then shown to be one of the survivors as well. As he says in all famous horror films, this is where the killer comes back for one final scare. Billy says boo, and is immediately shot in the head by Sidney. We see Dewey being taken away by an ambulance in the early morning as Gail has a new crew on site to begin a news report documenting the night's events. The original Scream is a classic slasher film and, like I said earlier, defined a generation of horror film addicts. This movie spawned a ton of films that tried to capture the same magic that the first Scream did. This movie launched the careers of many. To this day though, we still see the Scream franchise celebrated with the most recent Scream 5 and 6, and most likely a Scream 7 at some point in the near future. Okay, I remember this movie fondly as the first time I saw it, I was only 11 years old, hanging out with my very first girlfriend. The relationship didn't last, but my love for this movie sure did. Scream was able to bring horror back to the mainstream after it had died a slow death from the late 80s into the 90s. This truly was Wes Craven's last great film. Let me know what you think about Scream in the comments section. Until next time, I'll see you at the video store.